right, I'm going to go through a few of these pages, hopefully give you some support with what you need. So looking at this question first, you've definitely got most of the right ideas going on here. Your y-intercept is at -1, 100% agree. The slope, though, you have it written as -1 over 1.3. That's really close, except even though like you're starting from -1 down here, if you're looking at sort of the change from this point over to this point, but it's a bit confusing, but you're actually, to go from here to here, you're going up 1. So it's actually +1 over 1.3. The other tip I'm going to give you is it's easier to figure out the slope if you look for points on the line that happen where grid lines meet. Okay, so even though you can kind of read the value here as 1.3, I agree with that. I think it's actually easier to figure out the slope if you look between this point, where you know the coordinates, and then this point right here, where they're a little more obvious. So to go from here to here, you're going up 1.5, or you could even just count the grid squares, up 1, 2, 3. So that's your rise. And then you're going over, you can either write it as 4 if you're counting it along the labels on the axis, or you can count the grid squares over 4. Okay, so then your slope would either be, and I'll switch over to this. You could write it as 1.5 over 2. Okay, or if you wanted to just count the grid squares, you could write it as 3 over 4. Okay, either of those would be the correct answer. And you'll see, actually, if you were to check this on a calculator, you would see that they both give you the same decimal answer. Okay, let's go back over here. Okay, so, and then the way you've written the equation, I would make this slope positive, but everything else is correct here. Okay, so the way you've written your equation is good. Using those same ideas, looking at this next question, so your y-intercept is 2, nailed it, figured it out. But then I really encourage you to use that same idea of looking for a point on the line where it's easy to read coordinates, where your line passes through a place where grid lines meet. So that would be like this point right here. So you've got your y-intercept, easy to read right there. And then if you follow the line along to here, you'll see that again, you run into a point where it's pretty easy to count full grid squares to figure out the distance between points. Okay, so your slope for this, you're starting at 2. I really think most of the examples I've given you, this counting grid square strategy, it works as long as the scales on both axes are the same. So I really do think you can just count grid squares to figure out the slope here. You're going down 1, 2, 3 grid squares, and then you're going over 1. So your slope for that one, so for that next one, you went down 3 and over 1. So your slope is -3 over 1, which you can write as just -3. Okay, you don't need the over 1 there. And then I'm sure from there you can see what the equation would be now that you know the slope is -3. Okay. This next word problem, the cost to rent a hall for a hockey banquet is modeled by this equation, where C represents the total cost, and N represents the number of people attending the banquet. And there's a typo here. It shouldn't be plus 30,000. It should be just plus 3,000. So I'm sorry about that. A $30,000 hockey banquet sounds a bit excessive to me. Okay. So the number 35, what does that represent in this equation? So because that's a number that you're multiplying by the number of people attending, that's like the cost per person. So for each person, you have to pay $35 for their like food and drinks and whatever. So that's how you would describe that. What is the number 35? It represents the cost per person. You could also call it, in more general terms, it's the variable cost, the cost that will change depending on how many people attend. Okay, so two different ways we might write that. we could say 35 is the cost per person. Okay, so that's an answer that deals with like the specifics of the question. Or if you wanted to have sort of a more general answer that works for a lot of different of these scenarios, 35 is the variable cost. Okay, that's another correct way of answering that question. Okay. What does the number 3,000 in the equation represent? So this is maybe a bit confusing because there's this typo here. This number here was supposed to be 3,000, not 30,000. And that's the cost just to rent the hall, even if no one is coming to the banquet. Okay, so we can call that 3,000 is the cost to rent the hall. I'm going to call it the hall, assuming that the hockey banquet happens at a hall. I'm making some leaps there. Or if you wanted to give, again, like a more general answer, 3,000 is the fixed cost. Okay, so no matter how many people attend, you still have to pay that $3,000 to run your banquet. Okay, and actually a lot of pricing for events works that way, where you have a fixed cost. Okay, so just that's sort of the basics to cover cleaning and whatnot. And then you have a variable cost that depends on how many people attend. Okay. Next page here. Your significant other uses a secret linear mathematical formula to calculate the tip. Oh, I forgot this last one here. How much will a banquet for 200 people cost? So I'll just show you how to set that up, and then I'll leave it to you to finish it off. So your cost equals 35n plus 3,000. Okay, so we want to figure out the cost for 200 people. So I can rewrite it through 35 times 200 plus 3,000. Okay, and then you might want to throw that in a calculator, add it all up, and you should get a total cost for the hockey banquet. Okay, sorry, skipped ahead there a little bit. Next page, your significant other uses a secret linear mathematical formula to calculate a tip when they take you out for dinner. You want to figure out the formula. On Monday, you observe that the bill costs about $20 and they leave $23 in total. On Friday, the bill costs about $50 and they leave $57.50. What is the secret formula? Okay. So this is kind of a tricky question that I've given you here. I'm just going to sort of walk you through how to do it. So, what we want to figure out, basically, a tip is usually calculated as like a percentage. So, we know that when the bill was $20, with tip it came to $23. And we also know that when the bill was $50 with tip, it came to $57.50. Okay, so that essentially gives you, if you were graphing this on a line, this would give you 2 points on the line. Okay, and then to figure out the slope, that'll give you sort of what you multiply the bill by to figure out the total with tip. Okay, so here I've got x1, y1, x2, y2, and I would do y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. Okay, so kind of like you were doing earlier. And then you're just going to pull your values out from those two that we pulled out of the question. So you're going to do 57.50 minus 23 over 50 minus 20. And you're going to come up with some answer as a slope. And then your final answer, what is the secret formula? Y equals, and then you're going to have your slope times x. Okay? Oh, you can't see that because it's out of frame. Okay, so I didn't figure out the answer here, and then I left this as your final answer as something you can fill in. Okay? Let's look back there. I think there were a couple kind of context questions on that one. So, explain the secret formula in words. Is your special someone a good tipper? Why or why not? So, that's kind of that's something for you. It's kind of like an opinion question. So I'm also going to leave that for you to fill in on your own. And then we've just got these two questions. Use the following tables of values to develop a linear equation. So I'm going to do one of them for you, and I'm going to let you do the other one on your own. Okay, so I'm just going to write down the table for the second one. That one's a little bit trickier. And then I'm going to let you do the first one on your own. So we've got x, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. We've got y, negative 10, negative 20, negative 30, negative 40, negative 50. Okay. So, two things I want to figure out here. So I want to write an equation for my line in the form y equals mx plus b, where m is the slope and b is the y-intercept. Now, if you have a row on your table where x is 0, so like if one of these numbers here was 0, that would tell you your y-intercept right away. You wouldn't need to do any other math to figure it out. Unfortunately, this particular table doesn't have a 0 row, but I can sort of use patterns to figure out what y would be when x is 0, rather than having to do it algebraically. So what I see here is this is 100. And the pattern here was that I was just going up by 100 every time. So I could actually go backwards 100, and that would take me to 0. Okay, and then you can see that the pattern here is that I went down by 10 every time. So if I went up by 10, that would take me back up to 0, which fits the pattern, right? Because now I go down by 10 every row here, including if I start at 0, and I go up by 100 every row here, even when I start at 0. Okay? So what that tells me is that the y-intercept is 0. Okay? So then the next thing I need to figure out is my slope. So I would just pick 2 rows of the table. You want to look at your run, which is the change in the x. So I'm going up by 100. And your rise at the same time, the change in y, I'm going down by 10. So then my slope equals down 10 and over 100. And you can just leave it like that. You don't need to simplify it, but if you wanted to make it simpler, you might want to write it as negative 1 over 10 or negative 0.1. Okay, those are all accurate or reasonable ways of writing the slope, any of those 3. And then your answer would be y equals negative 0.1 x. And then you could write it as plus 0, or you could leave that part off, because when we add 0, it doesn't change the value. Okay, so then that's your final answer for this one. Okay, and hopefully the other example is doable for you as well.